Hi everybody, welcome back to the journey of my YouTube channel, and welcome to my last video where I'm looking back on my reading from 2022. After this, I'm going to start looking forward to 2023 and doing some other things, but I wanted to do one more kind of wrap up video on 2022 because I read a lot of Brandon Sanderson books in 2022. It was not my intentional plan to do that, but for me, 2022 was really the year of Sanderson. I know after the Kickstarter and with all of the secret projects coming out, 2023 is supposed to be the year of Sanderson, but for me, I think it's going to be the year of reading a whole lot less Sanderson because I just read so many Brandon Sanderson books last year. So I am only planning on reading Rhythm of War this year. I'm not planning on reading any other Sanderson books in 23. So if you read The Secret Projects or if you discover some older Brandon Sanderson books and they're really good, please let me know so that I can go ahead and put them on my TBR for 2024. But I decided that after all that I read in 22, I really kind of needed a mostly break from Brandon Sanderson books for this year. I do think some of the secret projects sound interesting. Maybe I'll read them eventually, but for now, I'm still just kind of looking back on the books that I read in 2022 by Brandon Sanderson because there were a whopping 9 of them. So today I'm ranking these 9 books in order of how much I liked them. So number 9, you can debate with me whether this should even count or not, but Skyward Flight, which is kind of 3 books and kind of not entirely Brandon Sanderson. So these are 3 novellas from the Skyward and Starsight and Cytonic series, and they're co-written with Jancy Patterson, so they're not even entirely Brandon Sanderson, and they're novellas, and technically you could count these as 3 or you could not count them at all. Whatever, I don't really care how you want to evaluate these, but I thought I would put it on the list because I went to the trouble of buying the book, and it is a pretty cool looking book to have in a video, so why not? But this is at the bottom of my favorites list for the year. I think just the fact that it's novellas really set them at a disadvantage because they take place in between the main books of the series, so they really can't advance all that much of the plot. There's not a whole lot that can change in the greater world of the story during these novellas, so I think that didn't help very much. I just didn't feel like they added a whole lot to the series. I didn't really find myself feeling super compelled to keep reading them. I did finish them, but mostly just because I don't DNF very much. So they were fine. I especially did like Alanik's novella. I liked the world building for her homeworld. I thought that was pretty cool. It's basically this whole planet where there's this poisonous fog covering the entire surface of the planet, but there are these enormous tree islands that float through the fog, and people can live in the branches of these trees, and each tree will be a whole city, basically these massive cities just spread out on the branches of the trees. And so I thought that was a super cool world building element. I enjoyed it a ton. But the fog that's below the trees is usually called miasma, and that word must have been used in this novella 50 times at least. That's not even an exaggeration. Like, miasma is kind of a weird, unusual word, and it was used like multiple times on every single page for certain sections of the story, to the point where I couldn't even see it without bursting out laughing. So that messed with me. And there was a twist at the end of Jorgen's story that threw me off a little bit. It just felt kind of unnecessary, and it felt kind of overly dramatic, I guess, kind of like a pulp sci-fi sort of twist. And normally I would say I like that. If it feels like pulp sci-fi, I would generally find that fun. But this one, I'm like, that's a very extreme thing to happen and wasn't really necessary. So I'm sure it will have a lot to do with book 4 of this series. When book 4 comes out, maybe I will understand the purpose of that more and actually like what happens at the end of that novella. But at the time, I was just kind of like, what? this is happening now? So that wasn't my favorite. And then FM's story, again, it was fine. It was just quite predictable. So I did like the climax okay. I enjoyed all the world building again, But yeah, these I didn't feel like measured up to the rest of the series. If you really like the series and really like the characters, then you'll probably enjoy these. I don't think you'll dislike them. And if you're like me and you took a long break after the first two books before reading Cytonic, it is a helpful refresh for that. I'm glad that I read these before I read Cytonic because they definitely helped me remember who is who in the series and just get back into that mindset. So it is useful for that. Speaking of Cytonic, that is number 8 on the list. So this is the third book in the Cytoverse series. And like I said, I'd kind of taken a break from the first two books before reading this one, but I was very excited for it because I enjoyed the first two books a lot, but I was also kind of concerned because I've heard about people who really liked the first two books and really didn't like this one. I even had one friend say that it kind of ruined the series. So yeah, I was kind of concerned going into this one, but I didn't feel like it ruined the series personally. I actually thought especially the first section was really fun. Because if you've read the first book, you know that there's this side of Spensa, the main character, where she loves the classic explorers from old Earth and the people from the legends, and she's really into that idea of the classic adventure. And that's also something that I really enjoy. And early on in this book, Spensa finally kind of gets to live that dream, and it's just really fun. There's a lot of, again, fun world building. It's a Brandon Sanderson book. I probably don't even need to mention the world building on each one because it's going to be really good. And there was an interesting new character that I was also enjoying watching, and he's kind of a mystery box, so trying to figure out who is he, what's he doing here, and what's going to happen with him. So I liked that a lot. In the middle section of the book, I was a little bit less engaged because there's the situation where a lot of the danger is removed, which means that a lot of the stakes are removed, and because of that, it just felt a lot less intense to me. And there's definitely a point for all of that. It's on purpose. It has to do with the theme and the character arc, so I get it. But just from a reading standpoint, it didn't feel like a classic adventure in the sense of having a ton of danger and always feeling like, is the main character gonna get out of this next scrape? Because there was just really no chance that anybody was going to get seriously hurt for a rather long stretch of the book. So that was a little bit odd. And then I thought that the twists at the end were fine. I'm okay with them. They are very Brandon Sanderson twists, and if you've seen my video about Mistborn Era 1 versus Era 2, then you know that I don't always jive perfectly with Brandon Sanderson's style twists. So that was the ending of this book. But again, I did like it overall. I still want to read book 4 when it comes out, but I think that I liked the other 7 Brandon Sanderson books that I read this year better than this one and Skyward Flight. Number 7 is Shadows of Self, which is the second book in Mistborn Era 2 / Wax and Wane, that series. So now we're getting into the 4 books of this series. I read all of them this year, and if you saw my top 10 reads of 2022 video, which I hope you did because I had a lot of fun with that video. If you watched that one, you know that I have had a really hard time ranking the 4 books of the series. I do have a clear favorite that I'm going to mention soon, but the first 3 books of the series, I just gave away which one is my favorite, I think. But the first 3 books of the series, I have a really hard time ranking because I feel like each one is better because the other ones are there. They're all very different. They focus on different characters and different aspects of the world and everything. But I have Shadows of Self at the bottom of the list currently. I might reevaluate that at some point. But the reason is just that for the first like 50 to 75% of the book, I felt like it wasn't quite as tight and cohesive as Alloy of Law was. I just felt like there were a lot of different things going on, quite a few different antagonists, quite a few scenes that didn't directly play into the main plot, and of course all of those things came together at the end, as they always will in a Brandon Sanderson book. Everything was significant, but I just felt like it wasn't quite as tightly paced as in Alloy of Law, and I just felt a little bit more lost for the first part of the book, which could have been more my fault than the book's fault. I read it in kind of a choppy way. So I definitely enjoyed Shadows of Self. It was a good time. It has one of the twistiest twists of all Brandon Sanderson books at the end, and that is certainly saying something. And this is another twist that I was okay with, that is probably not like on my top 10 list of favorite Sanderson twists or something. But yeah, I did like that big surprise aspect of this book and how a lot of things did come together even more than I expected, and how a lot of things from the prologue ended up being more important. Even than I thought they were going to be. So that part of it was definitely cool. 6 was Oathbringer. So we're getting into the Stormlight books that I read this year. So Oathbringer, of the 3 Stormlight books that I've read so far, this is currently 3 out of 3. Again, not because I didn't like it, and actually Dalinar's arc in this is one of my favorite things about the entire series. Again, I talked more about this in my top 10 fantasy reads of 2022 video that I really hope you guys will check out. But other than Dalinar's arc, I just felt like this one moved very slowly. There is an interesting mystery that Shallan is pursuing, but a lot of that actually got discovered or resolved. Not exactly resolved, but a lot of the mystery got figured out earlier in the book than I was expecting. And I just felt like it took a really long time to get to any important plot progress. I felt like it was about halfway through, I think, when we really started making progress on the plot. And then quite a few of the main characters spend quite a bit of this book in a setting that I just don't find quite as interesting as the setting of the first couple of books, which is odd. I feel like it should be an even more interesting setting technically. If you've read the series, I think you'll know what I'm talking about. I feel like it should be an even more interesting setting than just main primary normal Roshar, but I actually kind of find it less engaging than that. So I definitely enjoyed this, especially of course at the end it picks up and it starts getting a lot more intense. We got to see more of the villain, I guess. There are many antagonists, but one of the characters who most closely fits the role of a human villain, who is one of my favorite villains ever. We got to see more of him in this. So lots of good stuff, but also just lots of stuff. So it's a little bit of a slog, but still really an amazing work. Obviously it's worth the time to get through. It just is a lot to get through. Number 5 is Mistborn Secret History, which is an interesting one. It's another novella, and I think it's kind of weird that it's not more advertised among the other Sanderson books. I don't hear it talked about very much, and yet when I read it I was like, well, this is really important stuff. I think if you read Mistborn at all, you really should read Secret History, definitely after Era 1 and even probably after the first couple books of Era 2. But yeah, definitely read this one. It's very important, and you could easily not even know that it exists. So as the title implies, it really gives the backstory behind a lot of the things in Mistborn Era 1 that we didn't know were happening at the time. So again, to reference my video about Mistborn Era 1 versus Era 2, I felt like Secret History really addressed a lot of the things that bothered me at the end of Era 1 and kind of helped me come to a place of peace with the ending of Era 1 that had kind of displeased me in several ways. So I felt like my enjoyment of Era 1 hugely increased from reading Secret History. I found myself thinking, just why wasn't this in the Mistborn Era 1 books in the first place? And Brandon Sanderson does explain that in either the preface or the endnote. I don't remember which one, but it was just a lot of material to add to those already very long and complicated books. So I do understand that. I'm just kind of surprised that it's not advertised a little bit more frequently, like, hey, if you read Mistborn, you really need to read this because it's important stuff. So it was very interesting to see something that basically exists in between the other books and covers the span of the other books in a lot of ways, and just ties a lot of things together from those books, and provides quite a bit of setup for the Lost Metal, actually. So I definitely read Secret History before the Lost Metal. But I don't know, I guess it is kind of fun to have a somewhat secretive novella out there that that a lot of people might not even know about, that really reveals a lot about your world and characters from one of your most popular series. I guess that's a very Brandon Sanderson kind of thing to do, to just let people come upon this thing and discover it and be like, oh, well, this is here, this is cool. So so yeah, I enjoyed that a lot. It's a quick read, but very helpful. And number 4 is Bands of Mourning, which again, I've really gone back and forth about ranking this so high on the list. It possibly deserves to be down below Secret History and an Oathbringer. Specifically, I'm thinking of in the climax, there's a trope that's used that I was not a huge fan of, but I do really like the character arcs in this book. I feel like it's the third book in Era 2, and by this point, the characters and their arcs are getting a lot deeper than they were back in Alloy of Law. So I definitely enjoyed that, and we get to spend a lot more time with certain characters who were a little bit more sidelined in the early books, and some characters who were even just barely mentioned in the early books. And I also feel like Bands of Mourning has more of an Indiana Jones kind of influence, whereas the first two books I would primarily say were basically Sherlock Holmes plus Western plus fantasy, but then Bands of Mourning added in this more Indiana Jones style adventure, and I really enjoyed that a lot. So that's why that one is so high on the list. And then that kind of funnels right into my third Sanderson read of the year, which was Alloy of Law, so the first Wax and Wayne book. And I really like that it's just a detective book. It doesn't have the massive world-ending stakes of some of his other books, and I actually enjoyed that. Of course, it is tied into a lot more world level stakes. Eventually, by the end of the series, we find out that some of the things from book one are a lot more important than we knew they were at the beginning. So that's really fun, and that's also one thing that I like about it. But the primary thing about this one is just how fun it is, I think, and the pacing is so good, and there's so much action. It's kind of crazy, fights on top of a train kind of thing. Again, I talked about this in my my Mistborn Era 1 versus Era 2 video, but it's just a really fun and adventurous ride. The thing with Stormlight is that there's so much really good content in there, but it's so huge that you have to spend a lot of time and effort to get through the whole thing. But the nice thing about Mistborn Era 2 is that the books are so much shorter. They're not exactly short, but they're much shorter. They're easier to get through, and they move so much more quickly that they're easier to digest. So I think that's one reason why I enjoyed those so much this year, and I find myself ranking them pretty high in comparison to Stormlight. And speaking of Stormlight, number 2 on my list is Words of Radiance, which I would say has my favorite plot of the Stormlight books so far. Way of Kings has my favorite character arc, Words of Radiance has my favorite plot, and Oathbringer has my favorite backstory. So again, there are just different things about each one of these books that I like, but I would say that the most happened in this one plot-wise versus the other two Stormlight books that I have read. And of course, so much world building gets expanded on, and so many characters get developed or introduced. I felt like the beginning was probably the most engaging beginning of these books, and the first few chapters I was really kind of hurrying through, and then of course it's long, so I didn't hurry through it in general, but the first few chapters were just were really cool. And I should mention the really amazing illustrations in these too. I specifically remember some illustrations from this book that were really cool. I know those are in all of them, but I especially enjoyed some of the creatures that Shallan was sketching in this one. Shallan, though, probably is kind of the reason why this isn't my number 1 Sanderson book for the year. Not because I think she's not well written. I think she is, but I just don't connect to her all that much for some reason. And as I've mentioned before, I think it might be because we have a little too much in common. I really should relate to her because we actually have a lot of similarities. But I don't know, something about reading about her just doesn't connect with me as much as it probably should. But I did really enjoy the scene where Kaladin is using some of the new powers that he's discovering. He's finally starting to use them a little bit more effectively and a little bit more competently, and just the feeling of freedom and adventure and wonder, I guess, from him trying out his new abilities is the scene that I remember most from Words of Radiance. I just remember really enjoying that part. And then number 1, which is not a surprise because I gave it away earlier, and is even less of a surprise if you've seen my top 10 reads of 2022 video. The Lost Metal is I think my favorite Brandon Sanderson read from the last year. Words of Radiance is really close. Again, just Stormlight and Wax and Wayne are such different series that they're kind of hard to compare. But I really like The Lost Metal. It's the end of a series, a sub-series of Mistborn. So there's a lot that gets wrapped up. It's very climactic. A lot happens. The character arcs are really cool and come to some really good completions in this book. The stakes finally are world level, and I finally got an ending to a Brandon Sanderson book that I really am satisfied with. I a lot of times kind of have a hard time feeling satisfied with the endings of Brandon Sanderson books, but this one I felt like gave me everything that I wanted. So I was good with the conclusion of all of these character stories, and the overall plot of the series in general I thought was very well done. So I think that's exciting for the future of Mistborn, and just for the future of Brandon Sanderson's writing in general, that his most recent book is one of my favorite ones. I'm really glad to see that they're still getting better. And from what I've seen, other readers on BookTube seem to have really liked this also. I don't think I'm the only one who feels like this was a really good conclusion to the series. So that's exciting. Definitely glad that I got into the Wax and Wayne series this year. I wasn't sure that I would be a fan of this series at all, but I've definitely enjoyed it. So now I'm really excited for Mistborn Era 3. It's going to be a long time before we get that, but I'll be ready for it. Okay, so how about you? Did you read Brandon Sanderson books this year? Which ones were your favorites? If you did, did you read more than me? Did anybody read more than 9 Brandon Sanderson books this year? We should definitely talk about that if so. Or just if you read Brandon Sanderson books in general, let me know which ones are your favorites. And also if you're planning to read some this year, did you back the Kickstarter? Is this going to be the year of Sanderson for you? I wanna hear about all of your Sanderson reading. And then until next time, thanks for journeying with me. Bye.